By late summer 1863, the Confederacy was reeling from defeats at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Worse, the Army of the Cumberland had taken Chattanooga and was advancing into Georgia. However, the overconfidence of its Union commander gave the Confederacy its last chance to turn the tide and secure a strategic victory. This chance would be squandered thanks to the toxic work environment known as the Army of Tennessee's headquarters. Welcome to our latest video, in which the forces of the North continue to advance into the heartland of the South, where the Confederates would squander their chance for a decisive victory at the exceptionally bloody Battle of Chickamauga. Every week we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons: the Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job. President Lincoln hoped Major General William Rosecrans would follow up his victory at Stones River by quickly taking Chattanooga and finally fulfilling his dream of liberating Unionist East Tennessee. He would be sorely disappointed. The Army of the Cumberland had been badly mauled and needed considerable reorganization and reinforcement before it could advance. Even if the army was ready, winter in Middle Tennessee brought freezing rain, turning mountain roads between Murfreesboro and Tullahoma into waist-deep mudflows. Any advance had to wait for dry summer roads. Instead, Rosecrans spent the first 6 months of 1863 turning Murfreesboro into a major supply base and training center. Daily drills hardened and disciplined his soldiers, who received the latest weapons and equipment, while Rosecrans streamlined supply lines. When Rosecrans's army marched out, it would be the best trained and equipped one in North America. They would need to be both for the upcoming campaign. However, Washington only saw shades of McClellan in Rosecrans's endless preparations, which got worse every time he ignored their constant prodding to move. Politically, the Union needed more success from the Western armies to make up for the Army of the Potomac's defeats. And Lincoln needed it even more to set his increasingly anxious and depressed mind at ease. Additionally, Secretary Stanton was concerned that Bragg might leave Tennessee to reinforce Vicksburg. However, Rosecrans didn't care about political optics or the president's mental health and found Stanton's fears ridiculous. The military reality was that he couldn't do anything until the roads dried out, and unlike Grant, he refused to pretend otherwise and exhaust his infantry by slogging them through mud. Rosecrans also argued that Bragg was more likely to redeploy if attacked, so by waiting, he was pinning Bragg. Additionally, if Bragg did redeploy to Vicksburg, it would take months and leave Chattanooga exposed, which Jefferson Davis couldn't allow. The tension between Rosecrans and Lincoln grew so heated that General-in-Chief Henry Halleck contemplated dismissing Rosecrans, but instead just rebuked him for costing the War Department thousands of dollars in telegrams. The obstinate general responded that he'd already planned his operation for late June and wouldn't move beforehand. Had Lincoln and Halleck known the Confederacy's situation in Tullahoma, they would likely have applauded Rosecrans rather than rebuked him. The Army of Tennessee was starving. Tullahoma is located in the Tennessee Barrens, so named for its lack of agricultural land, meaning Braxton Bragg struggled to feed his army. Ironically, the critical Chattanooga railways he was protecting shipped tons of food to Richmond and the Army of Northern Virginia every day, but left none for him. Thus, his army suffered a very hard, hungry winter, made harder by the Martinet Bragg enforcing extreme discipline and rigorous training. However, the situation in headquarters was far worse. Bragg's top subordinates were difficult men in their own right, but Bragg's cantankerous inflexibility, coupled with a dour yet haughty personality, brought out the worst in those around him. The senior generals couldn't stop antagonizing each other. Leonidas Polk's open insubordination during the Kentucky campaign made it worse, and accusations of incompetence began flying back and forth following Perryville. In November, Jefferson Davis investigated the problem and saw how dysfunctional the generals were. Rather than acknowledge Polk's incompetence or Bragg's unpopularity, Davis simply confirmed Bragg's authority and implored them all to get along for the good of the Confederacy. Davis's problem was that he'd strongly admired Bragg since serving together in Mexico, while the fighting bishop was his old West Point crony. Rather than risk his personal relationships, Davis let the problem fester. The defeat at Stones River made it worse. His generals blamed Bragg for not continuing the attack on January 2nd, while Bragg blamed his generals for not attacking aggressively enough on December 31st. Bragg made it worse by circulating a letter that came off as asking for their opinion on his command, which set off a firestorm of criticism. Davis once again intervened, damping down the flames without putting out the fire. Unwilling to dismiss Bragg or reassign his subordinates, Davis passed the buck to Department of the West Commander Joseph Johnston, who passed it right back, utterly disgusted by Davis's cowardice. Additionally, his ability to replace Bragg was limited by the ambiguity about the Department of the West's authority. Therefore, Davis ordered Johnston to inspect the Army of Tennessee, implying that he would take over command if the army's condition were poor. However, Johnston reported that the Army of Tennessee was the best trained, equipped, and disciplined in the Confederacy. Its hunger wasn't Bragg's fault, so Johnston didn't dismiss him. Johnston's personal honor wouldn't let him profit at another's expense anyway. Johnston made it clear that replacing Bragg was Davis's responsibility, which Davis continued shirking. Johnston did soothe enough ruffled feathers for headquarters to function before leaving for the Vicksburg campaign. Both sides spent winter and spring wasting cavalry in pointless raids. Bragg had almost 16,000 horsemen, though he only directly commanded Joseph Wheeler's troopers. Nathan Forrest and John Morgan's semi-independent commands were exceptional raiders, but poor at intelligence gathering. All the commands launched ineffective raids, and Rosecrans's 9,000 troopers ineffectively raided Bragg right back. Wheeler's attempt to retake Fort Donelson ended bloodily in February. Forrest destroyed railways throughout Tennessee in March, but didn't meaningfully disrupt Rosecrans's supply lines. Federal raids ended in disaster in March and April. The capstone was Morgan's Ohio raid. In late May, he launched a massive raid into Ohio, despite Bragg explicitly ordering him not to. Panicked Northern papers believed that Morgan was a distraction or reinforcements for Lee's Pennsylvania invasion, but the timing was entirely coincidental. Despite doing considerable physical and psychological damage, Morgan didn't disrupt the Union war effort at all, and his entire command was captured on July 26th. With the roads sufficiently dried out, Rosecrans set June 24th as his step-off date. Rather than fight Bragg for Tennessee, he'd maneuver him out. The easiest route from Murfreesboro to Tullahoma was through Shelbyville, and Polk's corps had heavily fortified the town, anticipating that Rosecrans would attack there. William Hardee's corps held war trains to protect the main road and back up the cavalry patrolling the mountain passes. Therefore, Rosecrans ordered his reserves under Jordan Granger to feint in that direction, before sweeping east to take Bell Buckle Gap. The 20th Corps would seize Liberty Gap, while the 14th Corps slipped through Hoover's Gap. The 21st Corps would turn Bragg's right flank by marching through Bradyville to Manchester. Key to the operation was the Lightning Brigade, mounted infantry from Indiana and Illinois who'd brought their own horses and Spencer repeating rifles. They had to capture and hold the narrow Hoover's Gap on the first day, or the entire operation would bog down and fail. They did not disappoint, as the months of planning and training paid off. The feint towards Shelbyville completely tricked Bragg, and the Lightning Brigade seized Hoover Gap from the surprised Confederate defenders before holding off an entire division's counterattack, ignoring orders to retreat. McCook pushed through the initial defenses in Liberty Gap, but reinforcements and rain prevented further Federal advances until June 26th. However, Wheeler and Forrest failed to discover Crittenden's position, or that Shelbyville was a feint, allowing the flanking movement to proceed successfully. Hardee's disdain for Bragg compounded the problem, as he rarely and only tersely communicated with him. He'd decided that the Tullahoma position was deeply flawed, but rather than make his objections known, he'd concluded that Bragg was an idiot and quietly planned to save his men from Bragg's idiocy, ignoring established defensive plans. Thus, as Thomas once again advanced, Hardee withdrew his troops to Wartrace rather than to the second line of defences Bragg had prepared near Manchester. This gave Thomas an open road to the army's rear, forcing Bragg to withdraw into Tullahoma completely. Bragg intended to fight, but Polk and Hardee counselled withdrawing behind Elk River on June 30th, then to Cowan on July 2nd. However, Cowan wasn't defensible, forcing Bragg to order a full withdrawal to Chattanooga. Rosecrans expected to be lauded for his nearly bloodless achievement, but the victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg completely overshadowed him. His only praise was a telegram from the War Department urging him to march quickly and destroy Bragg's army, after which Rosecrans morosely protested that victories shouldn't be measured in spilled blood. Rather than blindly follow Bragg through unknown terrain, Rosecrans halted for a month to study the route south and rebuild his supply lines. Meanwhile, Richmond was panicking. If Chattanooga fell, all supply and communication lines west of Atlanta would be cut. Therefore, the Army of East Tennessee was redeployed to reinforce Bragg and hold Chattanooga, and Johnston dispatched reinforcements from Mississippi, though neither arrived in time. To improve the command problems, Hardee was assigned to Mississippi, but he was replaced by the even more quarrelsome D.H. Hill. Rosecrans still had no intention of directly fighting Bragg. Instead, the Lightning Brigade was dispatched to the ridges outside Chattanooga, where Bragg expected Rosecrans to attack. Beginning August 21st, the brigade began shelling Confederate positions while causing as much ruckus as possible, causing Bragg to shift his defenses to meet the oncoming attack. Meanwhile, Rosecrans marched the bulk of his army through Alabama to cut off Chattanooga from the rear. Bragg finally discovered that he'd been tricked on September 6th and withdrew on September 8th before the trap closed. Meanwhile, Lincoln's long-hoped-for liberation was underway. Ambrose Burnside had been reassigned to the west and given the 9th and 23rd Corps to reform the Army of the Ohio. He'd planned to march on Knoxville in early June, but orders to reinforce Grant with the 9th Corps delayed him until August. He finally got underway on August 16th, outflanking Confederate defenses in the Cumberland Gap. The Confederate brigades left behind to hold Tennessee were too dispersed to oppose Burnside, who took Knoxville bloodlessly on September 3rd. He then dispersed his troops to capture the remaining Confederates and secure East Tennessee. Unlike at Tullahoma, Rosecrans didn't pause to secure Chattanooga. Convinced the Confederates were utterly demoralized after losing both cities, he assumed they'd retreat to Rome, or even Atlanta. Therefore, Rosecrans overconfidently spread his forces out and advanced into Georgia. This should have been a disastrous mistake, but Confederate dysfunction saved him. Bragg had only actually retreated to Lafayette, 20 miles south of Chattanooga. There, the reinforcements finally caught up to him, and he learned that James Longstreet's corps was coming by train, though it had to travel a 900-mile-long detour due to Union control of the direct rail links. Bragg then prepared to counterattack. To encourage Rosecrans's delusion, fake deserters told him that Bragg was still retreating. Without verifying the intelligence, Rosecrans eagerly sent his cavalry to cut the rail lines, while each corps moved through a different pass, intending to link back up at Rome to trap Bragg. This was exactly what Bragg wanted, as Rosecrans's corps were too far apart to support each other. After his cavalry actually did its job and located the Federals, Bragg planned to ambush and destroy each column in detail. However, Bragg's generals failed him once again. Between September 10th to 13th, Bragg positioned overwhelming numbers against isolated Union divisions, only for the generals to find excuses not to attack, with only the highly competent Patrick Cleburne's division putting in real effort on September 11th. This snapped Rosecrans out of his delusion, and he issued orders to McCook and Thomas to rejoin Crittenden at Stevens Gap. Polk squandered another opportunity to ambush Crittenden's lead division, forcing Bragg to march north to confront Rosecrans's concentrating army, hoping that his 65,000 men, with another 12,000 on the way, could still destroy the 60,000 Federals. At 0700 on September 18th, Bragg's leading column took the wrong road and encountered Federal cavalry guarding Reed's Bridge across West Chickamauga Creek. The Federals were pushed back by noon, but no pursuit occurred, while the column figured out where it was. Further south, the Lightning Brigade held Alexander's Bridge, despite multiple attacks. At 1630, the Confederates crossed to the north at Lambert's Ford, and the Federals fell back to the Lafayette Road. Rosecrans realized what Bragg was up to shortly after first contact. Therefore, he had Thomas and McCook rapidly march to Crittenden's position and deploy along the base of Missionary Ridge after dark. Thomas became the left flank facing Reed's Bridge, Crittenden the center, and McCook strung out on the right, with reserves to the north at McAfee's Church. Unaware of these movements, Bragg planned to assault Crittenden's left flank, driving him into a river meander called McLemore's Cove and destroying him. Longstreet and his troops hadn't arrived, but several of his officers had, and Bragg happily replaced his enemies with the newcomers. The Battle of Chickamauga began by accident. Early on September 19th, Union patrols seeking to destroy Reed's Bridge and refill their canteens ran into Forrest's troopers near Jay's Mill. Forrest pushed forward to the main Union defences before Thomas counterattacked, believing that there was only one Confederate brigade across the river. Forrest called for reinforcements and halted the attack. Realizing that Rosecrans was further north than expected, Bragg shifted his army north to force Rosecrans back towards McLemore's Cove. What followed was some of the hardest fighting of the whole war. Bragg ordered his army to attack along the entire Federal line, one division at a time, starting in the north and working their way south. Thomas's corps put up a tremendous fight, giving minimal ground despite the relentless pressure. They were aided by the terrain constantly breaking up Confederate assaults before they reached the line, and Rosecrans continually shifting units from McCook and Crittenden's corps to replace Thomas's depleted men. As night fell, the fighting petered out, but didn't fully stop. Longstreet arrived shortly before dusk with his leading 5,500 men. Bragg eagerly reorganized his army to utilize Longstreet as Lee had, placing him in command of his left wing, with Polk commanding the right. They'd launch an echelon attack at dawn, with D.H. Hill's corps leading. Longstreet was to deliver the killing blow to the Union right after Polk pulled all reinforcements to the left. However, darkness and difficult terrain meant that Bragg's staff officers got lost delivering Hill's instructions. On the Union side, the presence of Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana ruled out a retreat. Therefore, Rosecrans and his generals restructured their line to better defend against reinforced attacks they knew were coming. Polk awoke slightly after 0500 to discover that Hill had no idea he was supposed to attack. Both men disastrously agreed to postpone the attack until after 0900, allowing the Federals to finish fortifying their line. When Bragg finally berated them into motion, their attacks fell apart against Thomas's breastworks, and by noon, Polk's wing was shattered. However, around 10:30, a Union staff officer thought he had discovered a gap on the right, near Brotherton, and warned Rosecrans. There wasn't one. Brannan's division was just hidden by thick brush. However, an increasingly mentally depleted Rosecrans had lost track of Brannan's location as he shuffled units around to meet attacks. Without verifying the report or consulting his subordinates, Rosecrans ordered Wood's division to move left and close the gap. Wood knew the order was wrong, but he obeyed anyway, creating a real gap from a fake one. He'd incurred Rosecrans's wrath twice already for questioning orders, and was unwilling to suffer a third. By pure coincidence, Longstreet was preparing to assault Wood's now vacant position. Bragg had grown frustrated with Polk's lack of progress, and ordered Longstreet to abandon the echelon sequence and attack with everything. Gradually realizing why the Western armies had performed so poorly, Longstreet fell back on his West Point training and prepared Napoleonic deep assault columns led by John Hood to break the Union line. At 11:10, the main column advanced, driving right through the gap. As Union units on both sides of the breakthrough began routing, Wood ordered a counterattack, which stalled the advance and cost Hood his right leg. However, panic began spreading, and soon the entire Union right was fleeing to Chattanooga. Rosecrans tried to rally the troops, but was forced to flee after narrowly avoiding capture. However, Thomas stayed and fought. He'd already pulled back towards Snodgrass Hill under Polk's relentless but uncoordinated attacks, and as the right broke, he extended the line onto Horseshoe Ridge. Retreating units quickly joined his line, and about 8,000 men stopped retreating in McFarland's Gap and began marching back to the battle. Additionally, Granger's reserves began marching towards the sound of guns, falling into Thomas's line. Around 1300, Longstreet met with Bragg to request reinforcements to finish off Thomas, only for a distraught Bragg to declare the battle lost, and Polk's troops were exhausted. At 1630, Thomas received orders to retreat to Chattanooga and made an orderly withdrawal under fire. The Battle of Chickamauga's casualty list was second only to Gettysburg. The Union suffered 16,170 casualties to 18,454 Confederates. Longstreet urged a vigorous pursuit, but Bragg refused. He was horrified at the casualties and wouldn't risk abandoning the wounded or asking exhausted soldiers to force march. Additionally, over half the army's draft animals had been killed, and they'd spent most of their ammunition. He'd reorganize and resupply from captured Federal supplies before advancing on Chattanooga. When Thomas arrived in Chattanooga, he found the normally confident and vigorous Rosecrans listless and uncommunicative. Lincoln described him as confused and stunned like a duck hit on the head. He had his men reoccupy the Confederate fortifications and resupplied them, but did nothing else, handing Bragg the initiative. Bragg's logistical problems meant his only option was to besiege Chattanooga. He didn't have the ammunition for bombardment, but could try starving them out. Beginning September 25th, Bragg shut off river, road, and rail access to Chattanooga, leaving only a single mountain trail supplying Rosecrans, which Wheeler easily raided. Storming wasn't an option, as something was wrong with his army. He didn't know it, but Confederate morale never recovered from the deep psychological scar left by Chickamauga. Hill commented after the war that the elan of the Southern soldier was never seen after Chickamauga. His generals prodded Rosecrans to do something, but all he did was languidly make plans without executing them. By mid-October, Chattanooga was nearing starvation, but the Confederates were about to explode. The recriminations between Bragg and his generals got so bad that Davis went to Tennessee personally to allow Bragg to reassign Polk and dismiss a number of more junior officers. Rosecrans's predicament had Washington panicking. Burnside sent reinforcements to Rosecrans, but they were turned back by Forrest in late September. Therefore, Washington turned to the hero of Vicksburg. U.S. Grant had been securing central Mississippi and exploring options for further campaigns when word of Chickamauga arrived. He immediately dispatched Sherman's corps, but that wasn't enough. He was ordered to take command personally on September 29th, as he was to be appointed to Supreme Command in the West shortly. Washington also reactivated Joseph Hooker and gave him the 11th and 12th Corps from the Army of the Potomac, before shipping them 1,233 miles in 11 days to Bridgeport, Alabama, arriving October 6th. Hooker immediately marched for Chattanooga. Grant's appointment came through on October 17th, and the next day he relieved Rosecrans, who didn't object. Thomas was ordered to take command and hold until Grant arrived on October 23rd. Rosecrans had been working on a plan alongside engineer Brigadier William Smith to use Brown's Ferry as a new supply line, but hadn't implemented it. Upon Grant's arrival, Thomas explained the plan and was ordered to execute it immediately. At 3 a.m. on October 27th, engineers and assault teams floated downriver on pontoons past the defences on Lookout Mountain to Brown's Ferry. There, the assault force dispersed the defenders, while the engineers built the bridge. The Confederates attempted to counterattack, but pulled back when Hooker was spotted arriving through Lookout Valley. At 2300 on October 28th, Longstreet attempted to drive Hooker off with a night attack, but was repulsed. The next day, supplies began arriving in Chattanooga again. As the first crates were full of hardtack, the route was named the Cracker Line. With Chattanooga resupplied, Bragg knew the siege had failed, but he couldn't just retreat. His only hope was to get around Grant's left flank and recut the supply routes, but that required control of the railway through Knoxville to Virginia. Therefore, on November 3rd, Longstreet was ordered to defeat Burnside and retake Knoxville. Longstreet objected to dispersing the army, but went anyway, eager to return to Lee and his functional army. Longstreet intended to destroy Burnside's forces piecemeal. However, Forrest's raiding had Burnside on alert, and when he learned that Longstreet was coming, he ordered his army to fall back to Knoxville's defences. Longstreet tried to trap Burnside at Campbell's Station, but a masterfully executed fighting withdrawal let him reach Knoxville on November 17th. Longstreet didn't have the numbers to either storm or starve out Burnside. After a surprise assault failed, Longstreet was left to ineffectively stare at Burnside. While waiting for Sherman, Grant and Thomas planned to rid themselves of Bragg. The plan called for Sherman to cross the Tennessee via a pontoon bridge before assaulting Bragg's right flank via the northern end of Missionary Ridge on November 24th. Hooker would launch a simultaneous attack on Lookout Mountain. Grant thought Thomas's troops still too dispirited after Chickamauga, and so limited them to a reconnaissance in force against the center to pin Bragg. On November 23rd, Thomas's patrol seized the Confederate position in Orchard Knob, which caused Bragg to withdraw units from his flanks to the center. The next day, Hooker's assault went off without a hitch. Using heavy fog and broken ground as cover, Hooker's 12,000 men took the 9,000 Confederate defenders by surprise and easily routed them in a fight romanticized as the Battle Above the Clouds. However, Sherman was delayed. What appeared on maps as the foot of a continuous ridge was actually a solitary hill separated from Missionary Ridge by a deep ravine. Worse, Cleburn's division was dug in across the ravine on Tunnel Hill. Therefore, Sherman halted for the day to consult with Grant. On November 25th, Sherman attacked after dawn, but got nowhere against Bragg's best division. Hooker was advancing towards Missionary Ridge, but progress was slow due to destroyed bridges and steep slopes. Grant was holding Thomas in reserve to be deployed once Sherman made the ridge, but seeing the flank's slow progress, ordered him to advance and clear the rifle pits at the base of the ridge as a distraction to help Sherman at 15:30. As the Army of the Cumberland advanced, some Confederate defenders had orders to fire 2 volleys and then fall back, but most did not. Seeing the planned withdrawal and believing it was a rout, the defenders began fleeing up the slope, and the Federals followed. No orders were given. Still, a collective desire to prove themselves to Grant and revenge drove them in a wild charge up the slope. Panic spread, and the Confederates fled rather than fight. A staunch rearguard action by Cleburne prevented pursuit. A physically, mentally, and spiritually broken Braxton Bragg tendered his resignation to Davis as he retreated to Atlanta, and was finally replaced by Johnston. Longstreet gave up on Knoxville and wintered in the Tennessee mountains before returning to Lee. So ended the Western Campaign. Richmond had effectively no communication with anything west of Atlanta. The remaining Confederate forces abandoned the interior to defend the coast and Atlanta in anticipation of the upcoming Union campaign against the city. We will cover that campaign as this series continues, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.